So in learning this work and preparing to perform it, what's sort of the physical challenge like of taking on this whole piece at once? As you said, it's about 45 to 50 minutes long, which is extremely long, and you have demanding passage after demanding passage.
Right.
So is there a way you have to think about pacing yourself?
I do. You know, it's so funny because in many ways I like to, well, there are a couple kinds of pacing that I'm thinking of. One, first of all, one is of stamina. Just the ability to get through the whole thing mentally and physically. Because keep in mind, it's not just that the expanse is there, that the register is wide, but the volume is also loud through a lot of it. Right? I mean, it's symphonic writing for the piano, so it takes power as well as, you know, the ability to cover wide spans. Right?
How does it compare? So you played Chekhov's Concerto, and you've played.
I played a number of the Rachmaninoff concertos.
How does it feel different than playing those to you? Does it?
It's more uncomfortable. Definitely more uncomfortable. I think because the writing is less idiomatic for the instrument. But I think it's also the case that it poses a different kind of challenge, because when you want to make color changes, when you want to phrase something, when you've got stuff that's so spread out, in some ways you feel like you got to wrap your arms around the world to make it happen, if that makes any sense. It's no longer a microcosm, but it really is the universe that you're trying to embrace. So spatially there's that challenge, right? But going back to the pacing element, you know, of having the stamina, the mental and physical stamina to go through this, part of that is also just wanting to be able to say something through the writing in spite of its unidiomatic nature.
Right.
And that's the other challenge, the pacing challenges. If you just think technically, right, you're going to fall far short of what you're trying to do. And yet that in and of itself is bad enough, right? The writing is working against you, technically. But then you've got to be able to change colors and phrase.
Right, and a lot of that difficult stuff to the audience may not, some of it sounds difficult, but some of those flashing curves, scales, and thirds, they fly by. And if they're played right, the audience
doesn't even notice it.
Yeah, they don't know what
that is so true. Yeah. That's so true. So I sometimes wonder if this is an exercise in humility, a kind of spiritual journey for the pianist, as you say, to allow struggle to show through in some ways, in some of these passages, that maybe therein lies the expression itself, right? The kind of emotion that he wants to draw out versus the total command that we associate with, say, the technique of a Rachmaninoff or, you know, a Chopin or a Liszt, you know, when they would play their concertos, that they would just whip it off. So you have some of that, but you also have this element of showing struggle. So
for an audience member who's coming to this who maybe doesn't know this piece or doesn't know symphonic concerto repertoire that well, it's a big challenge for a listener too, as you admitted, because as a young pianist you found it challenging.
I did, yeah.
So what would you say? Now it is easier to, I think, experience a piece live because you get to see all this stuff happening in front of you. But what would you suggest to a listener as a way to, you know, to sort of think, not to narrate the piece because that's not their job necessarily, but as a way, you know, things to listen for, things to look for. Any ideas about that?
I think, you know, this one thing, like in the first movement, as an example, ba 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 dee da 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 dee, that theme. Just to listen for this ya ta ti. How many different things he can do with just that 3-note sequence, that rising 3-note sequence. It is all over the place in that first movement. And he's constantly using that little germ to create new material. And so that technique of developing variation has been something that he embraced his whole life. That's how he wrote music, you know, is by varying little motives just a little bit to create new materials, but yet it's clearly genetically linked to that original material. So I think to the extent that they can, that listeners can grab onto simple melodic motives and see how many times they recur and are recast in different settings, emotional settings and harmonic settings, textural settings, that's actually a fun thing to do. But I think another part of this at an emotional level is to see the range of emotion that is presented, to appreciate it for that, really that in and of itself, is to say what emotion is being projected here and what follows and what difference, you know, what range.
Yeah. No, I had that when I was listening to the piece this morning, and I always think of the first movement as just grandeur and beautiful and majesty. But there, as you said, there's so many passages that have this, maybe not darkness of the word, but the sense of great struggle. And so I think it is interesting to wonder, where does that come from?
Yeah.
And, how do those elements clash, and then how do they
That's right.
coalesce?
And one of the challenges as a performer, both for the orchestra and also for the soloist, is how to navigate those differences in a way that makes sense.
Yeah. So
With
it
the
doesn't just-
tempo,
right.
for example, and the phrasing and the dynamics. Right, because, there is a tempo marking, allegro non troppo, quarter note equals 92 for the metronome, all the way through, but it doesn't make a bit of sense to play the entire movement at that tempo at all. So there's a lot of fluctuation and vacillation, and apparently in the manuscript, in the original, Brahms wrote all these little sort of tempo indications, like slow down here, sustained here, a little bit more animato here, and he took them out because it was beginning to dice up the continuity of the tempo too much. He feared that, and he was also very, very careful as a craftsman, right? I mean, you remember how in all his works we see this level of control, right, that he exercises.
In a way, it's nice if he was willing to give back a little and trust the musicians to make those, trust the musical intuition. Of
That's right, and he did just that, in order, for the sake of the integrity of the first movement to hold sway. So he gives us that license, but with that license, of course, comes great responsibility, right? So
I like that you mentioned that this piece is like chamber music, which seems counterintuitive because it's so big. I mean, and we tend to think of chamber music as being something intimate, but that is a great thing to listen for here too. Is the dialogue with the orchestra and all he uses the orchestra so beautifully. The horn solo, and the cello solo.
Oh, tremendous.
So is it a difficult piece to put together with orchestra? Do you find, or does it go together pretty straightforward?
It's difficult in the sense that right now we've only had one rehearsal and we still have 2 more to go. We've only played it at one tempo per each movement.
Yeah.
So the difficulty lies ahead of us in the sense of navigating the transitions, right? And restoring tempo and slowing down and, that sort of thing, taking time and then coming back to the quarter equals 92, for example, in the first movement. So we have yet to work on those transitions, and that's where I think the challenge will lie in the artistic sense. Where it is easier, however, versus a lot of other concertos, and it's one of the reasons why I pulled back from the idea of Prokofiev 3, is rhythmically speaking. And what I feel is important for a student orchestra, I want them to have an artistic experience that will stay with them. In other words, I don't want them to feel like they got to hang on as if their survival depends on it.
Has that kind of
yes, absolutely.
Dynamic,
And rhythmically speaking, you're in panic mode. You're afraid of late entrance or whatever it might be, or not clear enough rhythms or definition, whatever it might be, tempo slowing down. I don't want that kind of experience for them. I want them to feel like rhythmically they have a grasp of this, musically they have a grasp of this, tempo-wise they have a grasp of it, so that they can move on to that even higher level of existence, right? And appreciation, which is the artistic level.
And it's nice for them because it's a piece where the orchestra is by no means ever an accompaniment, just an accompaniment.
Absolutely, right.
So
it is a symphony, right?
Is,
orchestra in its truest sense. So for those various reasons, I chose this work for my own journey, but also so that it's something that benefits a student orchestra on an artistic level.
Oh, that's great.
Yeah.
Absolutely.
So.
So is this? Do you feel like this is one of the bigger pianistic challenges you've taken on, or? I
do think so, in a very different way, obviously, because it's using the piano in a very different way than I'm used to playing, and so. But it's funny. It's such a noble work, and it requires of me to almost take on an older persona. I mean, I almost have to approach it as if I am a person in my 70s that has lived a complete life and is looking back.
Well, you played a lot of late Beethoven too, and
right.
That music has the same reputation.
Sure.
We tend to want to think it's just for the senior citizens, but
right. It has a lot to teach the young too, and I've definitely viewed this as that, a kind of lesson. In a life that has been already lived and lived well.
Great. Well, congratulations for taking
thanks,
this on. I'm
Michael.
looking forward to it. Thanks for doing this.
Appreciate that. A pleasure.
All right.